Golden State Media Concepts Baseball Podcast. We cover everything Major League, from spring training to the World Series. We've got your favorite club covered, from New York to Boston to LA. This is the Golden State Media Concepts Baseball Podcast.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the GSMC Baseball Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Jack Ridenauer, and I've got quite the show in store for us today. A lot of things to discuss, but hope everyone has been doing well and staying safe. I've been absolutely all over the place with all of these sports back in action at the school I announced for. It's unfortunate that it's only for the next few weeks because the season started so late because of COVID. Things didn't start really happening until the end of January, early February. Now we're actually doing spring and fall sports, both going on simultaneously. So a lot of things going on, kind of a jam-packed month and a little sprint to the finish, if you will. But it's a really great sign that the season still continued on, and because it kind of looks into the crystal ball a little bit and into the future of next year and into next school year that, hey, they probably will have sports back up and running normal times, fall sports in the fall time, winter sports in the winter time, and so on. So this might be a good sign for moving forward. Again, kind of a weird year this year, but it's really positive that moving into next year and next school year, things could possibly be back to somewhat of some normalcy. But let's get into today's show, right? I want to get into a little recap from the games from the night before. I'm going to go through the AL West teams and pick each team's MVP and a whole lot more. So let's get into it, and I'll first jump into the news and headlines that are going around the MLB and what all that has been going on in the MLB recently. And later on, I'll get into a recap from last night's games. I'll get into the scores and also some of the major performances from around the league. And then after the game recaps, I'll get into discussing which players on AL West teams are those respective teams' MVPs and what kind of seasons they need to have for these teams to be successful this year. And then be sure, as always, to stick around for the final few minutes of the show today, where I'll get into a buy it or deny it, discussing whether I buy or deny the idea that if the Angels don't make the playoffs, Mike Trout will demand a trade at some point after the season. So a lot of things going on today, jam-packed show like I mentioned, but I want to first get into a little bit of news that comes from the Dodgers camp, kind of comes from the pitching side of baseball, if you will, and it involves Trevor Bauer, who has come under some scrutiny lately and really in the last few years with his vocalization of the increased spin rates, but now he is subject to the potential increase in spin rates and use of foreign substances to enhance those spin rates. So basically, last week on April 8th against the Oakland Athletics, a couple people on both the Athletics and kind of their personnel and their staff were bringing some baseballs that Trevor Bauer was using to pitch, bringing those balls' attention to the umpire, saying, hey, these balls are sticky, these balls have certain cut marks on them. And for people that may or may not know, baseballs are a very interesting thing, because if you cut a baseball a certain way, if you have a really long fingernail and you're able to make divots in the ball will move accordingly. The ball will move into certain directions, and it'll make weird, movement, if you will, that isn't normal for a ball that has not been carved up and cut up and whatnot. So a lot of players, they don't want that to happen, and a lot of umpires, that's why you see umpires constantly throwing balls out, because those balls will get a divot in them because it goes in the dirt or whatever. And if they keep using those baseballs, well, it gives an unfair advantage to the pitcher because, again, the movement is just out of bounds. But there was numerous baseballs that were being brought to the umpire, and people were saying, hey, there's something up with these baseballs. And I had mentioned this before. The MLB basically this year is going to start really cracking down on pitchers that are subject to incredibly high spin rate increases in their pitches, and kind of relating it to using foreign substances to get a better grip to increase that spin rate. And again, a lot of players have kind of started to come under scrutiny, and Trevor Bauer is one of them. He actually said a couple years ago how he's been trying to figure out how to increase his spin rate, and the only way he's been able to do it is through foreign substances. And he found that out through other people in the MLB. And now some of these baseballs that he was using were sent off to labs for testing. And the MLB is, I think, going to have a very hard time figuring out a fine or a suspension for Bauer if there is a foreign substance on it, because how are they going to prove that it was him that was putting that foreign substance on it? For all the umpires and the MLB know, somebody might have had sunscreen on their arm, they wipe their arm, they get a grounder over to them, they throw the ball to first base, and all of a sudden the ball's sticky. And then again, Trevor Bauer is using it, at bat after at bat, pitch after pitch, and he's going to be the one that has the finger pointed at him. And the other thing is this: how are they going to crack down on something that they've never actually punished before? So what is kind of the bar or the standard for punishment in terms of using a foreign substance for pitchers? Is it a game suspension? Is it a $5,000 fine? I mean, that's going to have to be something that is defined also, so there isn't kind of this issue that the NFL, for instance, has, where they're constantly fining players or suspending players for illegal hits or hitting a QB too hard, whatever it might be, and as a result, it kind of dulls the game and it aggravates people. And not to mention, the pitchers are going to get very aggravated also. But it's just ironic that Bauer has been so outspoken about this, and yet now he's kind of, I don't want to say getting caught, but he's now kind of under the microscope of the MLB. But it's just going to be interesting to see how the MLB handles this, because I'm curious to see what is going to be the standard of punishment, or if there's going to be any sort of issuing of a punishment at some point or another for not necessarily Trevor Bauer, for other guys, that are using increased spin rates or whatever it might be. How are you going to come down on somebody that you've never had to punish before? But let's face it, they weren't sure how to punish for guys using steroids before, and they figured that out. So I'm sure they'll figure it out. But moving out of that story and actually getting into another kind of interesting little tidbit from the NL West, also a rival now of the Dodgers in the Padres camp. Recent added Padres pitcher Joe Musgrove, he just completed the first ever no-hitter not only in his career, but also in Padres history. I mean, talk about how monumental that is. Musgrove actually, he comes from the Pirates, and I'm going to kind of get into this a little bit, but it's another instance where former pitchers from the Pirates wind up leaving, and then they go off and have really successful careers after the fact. And after one point and after one player, it's like, okay, maybe they just had a career resurgence and they had a little bit of a second career on another team, and the Pirates, it just didn't really work out. But it's player after player after player after player. It's a constant recurring theme. And Musgrove pitched great against the Rangers. I mean, he pitched really well. Didn't have a ton of run support. They only won 3-0, but he still went the whole way and gave up no hits, 10 Ks, no walks. And what's even cooler is that he's actually a San Diego native. He grew up as a Padres fan. So, I mean, talk about being able to live out a dream and live out an experience. And not many people can say they did. Pitch for the team that you grew up watching in the area that you grew up in, throwing a no-hitter for the first time in that team's history. That's you can't really get more storybook than that, in my opinion. But what's really unfortunate about the Padres' history with no-hitters is that they've had a lot of close calls. A lot of the no-hitters that they've had from pitchers in the past have usually ended in the ninth inning with 2 outs, and it's kind of been a recurring, constant thing for them. And Musgrove, again, he had never actually, up until that point, he had never recorded a 25th out in any of his outings. And he was able to get over that hump, and all of a sudden, we've got history in the making, not only for Mr. Musgrove, but also for the Padres. And it was interesting also reading an article on The Athletic about it. The night before, he was doing this kind of hydration style of preparation where he just drinks a lot of water, and the next day he's completely hydrated. I'm not quite sure the science behind it. I'm not a scientist. I am not a health expert, so I don't know what. I'm sure it does wonders for you. But he was kind of joking that he was worried he was going to have to go to the bathroom the entire time because he was so hydrated. And he wound up not having to do that, and he did finish the game. But still, it's kind of like, those little fun under-the-radar stories or those under-the-radar tidbits that people don't really know about that happen in a no-hitter. They always wind up happening. And from what I also heard, I believe I was listening to Jeff Passan on ESPN say this, I guess Musgrove did not feel great in warm-ups. I guess he did not have a good couple warm-up pitches. He did not have a great warm-up bullpen. All of a sudden, he goes out and just puts it together. And that's kind of the interesting factor of this, is that even if you're not able to put together a great performance, you still are able to, or at least in the warm-up, then all of a sudden something just clicks, and it just kind of rolls from there. So congratulations to Mr. Musgrove and the Padres. I mean, a very, 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 very cool milestone for him, and really the whole organization, too, finally getting their first ever no-hitter. And now they are one of the teams that no longer doesn't have a no-hitter in their history. But I want to wrap up this first segment with a little news that kind of pertains to another former MLB player now wanting to also get into ownership with a professional sports team, as Alex Rodriguez one of the greatest baseball players ever. I know his career's been marred with steroid use here and there, but he was still a very good player for the most part. He's actually inching closer and closer to being in ownership of the Minnesota Timberwolves in the NBA. So Glenn Taylor is the owner now of the Timberwolves. He's owned the team for 27 years. They haven't been very successful in his 27 years, only one major playoff run, but at the same time, he actually took the team from being, worth $88 million in 1994 to all of a sudden being worth over $1.5 billion. So he's made a great investment in owning the Timberwolves. But he's wanted to kind of pass it on to other people. There's nobody in the family that really wants it. And so as a result, Alex Rodriguez and then also cryptocurrency mogul Mark Lohr, both very good friends of each other, are both trying to get, and they have already signed the letter of intent to have the team passed over to them after a 2.5-year kind of gap, if you will. So basically there's a contract, or there's kind of this letter of intent, if you will, where Taylor will retain sole control, really, of, or I would say 80% of control of the Timberwolves for the next 2.5 years. Rodriguez and Lohr will be brought on into kind of an ownership group almost, and they'll form this little group together with Taylor. And as a result, after the 2.5 years is up, both Rodriguez and Lohr will own the Timberwolves 50-50. So a very interesting thing. And Rodriguez, he's a very good businessman. I mean, he's on Shark Tank. He's one of the best, I would say, analysts that ESPN has across all sports, not just baseball, but I would say all sports. He does a wonderful job. Not to mention, business-wise, he's made some incredible calls. I mean, if I'm not mistaken, I was reading an article. He made some investments into GoPuff earlier on, so the delivery service for snacks. I mean, he made some very wise moves business-wise. And I think this is another one. And not to mention, he brings that former athlete kind of lifestyle and that mindset. So he can be a related or a relatable individual for the players on the Timberwolves. But then also Mark Lohr comes in and he brings the business side of it. But what's great about Rodriguez is he's also got that business side. So Rodriguez is a very dynamic individual in all of this. And actually, Lohr and Rodriguez, they were part of the ownership group that was trying to make a bid for the Mets. They wound up losing to Steve Cohen, who now owns the team. But Rodriguez wants to stay involved in sports. It's very clear. And having this investment and having this ownership of this team, I think it's a very wise move on his part. And there have been some talks of, the team maybe moving to Seattle because there are close ties with Alex Rodriguez in Seattle, but they haven't really gone in that direction quite yet. And I think that Glenn Taylor does not want the team to actually leave. And not to mention, they'll also have ownership of the Minnesota Lynx, the WNBA team. So both teams will be owned by both Mark Lohr as well as Alex Rodriguez. So again, another instance of either former athletes, current athletes, taking into some part ownership of a professional sports team. We've already seen LeBron James go in and get a little investment and a little ownership part of the Boston Red Sox. We already know that Patrick Mahomes has a little bit of an investment and is also a part owner of the Kansas City Royals. So this could continue to be a trend where former athletes or current athletes start owning other sport teams and start having investments. And quite frankly, I think it's a very, very wise thing. Because, again, now you've got somebody in ownership that can speak on behalf of those athletes, that can say, hey, I know what that's like. I know what they're going through. I've been there. I've done that. Business people can't reason with that, right? Business people cannot do that. As much as they'd like to, even if you were a former athlete, being a professional athlete is a totally different ballgame, right? It's a totally different ballgame. So as a result, if you've got somebody on your side that is a former athlete and that kind of knows the ins and outs of a professional athlete's lifestyle and the day in and day out kind of routine, then you can have a little bit better reasoning and understanding of what they have to go through on a daily basis and how to maybe better, tailor your ownership or tailor how you run your team into that ways that you can have your players happy, right? You want to have, they always say people that are in business, you want to have your employees happy. And I'm not saying that players are employees, but I'm saying, they are part of the team, they're part of the franchise, they're part of the organization. And I think that if the ownership treats the players right, vice versa. And, we've seen it in other instances in other teams where, the ownership was not treating the players right and there was kind of a silent rebellion or there was a silent kind of, disgruntlement between the players and ownership. And you never want to have that because I think it affects things on the court, on the field, wherever. But nonetheless, I think a very wise move for Alex Rodriguez, a very smart investment. Not to mention, I think he could really turn the team around. I'm a huge NBA fan, so I know the Timberwolves are not very good at all. And having him kind of go in there, revitalize things, a fresh set of eyes, a fresh mind to kind of bring in fresh ideas, the Timberwolves could be a completely different team in the next couple of years. And that goes for other MLB teams, right? I mean, I would love to see other professional athletes maybe try and get into the ownership of teams that are comparable to the Minnesota Timberwolves in the MLB. So perfect example, the Seattle Mariners or the Texas Rangers, teams that have kind of struggled the last few years that do have some promise, I think, that do have a lot of very, very beneficial kind of attributes that they bring, whether it's the location of where they are in the city or how popular they are, the popularity of the sport in general, in which, whatever it might be. I think that's when you can really start to develop a better business plan and then start getting a better team to field onto the field, and then all of a sudden you've got a completely different franchise that's going to start competing. So we're going to have to keep a very close eye on other athletes that might start doing this, because I think it'll start becoming a trend as we kind of move forward into the future. And I think that we're going to start seeing more professional athletes kind of almost crossing over into other sports and getting into ownership. But it's going to be a fascinating thing, because I think it could really change a lot of things. I think it could be a very beneficial thing for a lot of people, and especially for just the teams overall. And then at the end of the day, a great team, a successful team, happy fans, and then everybody's winning, right? Everybody enjoys it. The players are doing well. Ownership is doing well. The team's doing well. The fans are loving it. The city's... So it kind of trickles down from there. So, again, something to keep an eye out for moving forward. But, folks, that's going to do it for us in this first segment. But don't go anywhere, because when I get back from the commercial break, I'll get into discussing a recap from the games from the night before and which players had some outstanding performances for their respective teams. Folks, stay right there. We'll be right back here on the GSMC Baseball Podcast.
This is your ultimate stop for everything sports. The Golden State Media Concepts Sports Podcast. Should I say more? From the NFL, MLB, the NBA, to MMA, it's all in here. The Golden State Media Concepts Sports Podcast. Listen now.
Welcome back to the GSMC Baseball Podcast. Jack Ridenauer with you all, and in our first segment, I got into the latest news in the MLB and touched on some big-time headlines. But folks, make sure you stay right here with us on the GSMC Baseball Podcast for the final segment today, where I'll get into a buy it or deny it, as I'll mention whether I buy or deny the idea that if the Angels don't make the playoffs this year, Mike Trout will demand a trade after the season. I want to now get into a little recap of last night's games and discuss some scores, some stat lines, and really where teams are sitting right now in the standings. So, again, I'm recording this as of April 13th, Tuesday, so I'm going to go through the Monday games. We actually had a couple games postponed. The Boston Red Sox and the Twins game, Mariners and Orioles, Phillies and Mets all were postponed. So getting into the games that went through and played, going to start off because, again, on my MLB app, I have my favorite team saved on there. That's the Brewers, so we're going to start with the Brewers game. They were taking on the Cubs. Brewers actually won 6-3, but here's the interesting thing. They only scored one time throughout the entire game. They only scored in one half inning. Bottom of the sixth, they put up 6 runs, and they really were, I think, saved personally from Freddie Peralta. I mean, he struck out 10, pitched great for the Brewers, picked up his second win of the year. He's got a .69 ERA, and then also Josh Hader picked up a save. But again, Cubs actually started out with the first run of the game, scored in the top of the fourth with 1 run, and then Milwaukee followed up with that huge bottom 6th inning. Chicago did kind of knock at the door at the end, scored 2 runs in the top of the 9th, but that was really all she wrote for the Cubs, and now the Brewers are 6-4. So a really, really good sign for the Brewers that, again, they're able to take on teams like the Cubs that can put up a decent fight, I think, that are teams that are definitely, worthy of being potentially in the first place spot for the NL Central, could even be a playoff team, again, if they put things together and if they play well. But kind of running through some numbers from the game, Jackie Bradley Jr. was 1 for 4, Keston Hiura was 1 for 3, going through a couple other guys, Avisel Garcia, he was 1 for 2, so they've been getting some pretty decent hitting across the board. Again, it's a little sporadic here and there, but over for the Cubs, I mean, it was a struggle. They only amassed 4 hits the entire game. Chris Bryant was 2 for 4, so he had half those hits. Javi Baez was only 1 for 4, and then also Wilson Contreras was 1 for 3. So not a great hitting outing for the Cubs. And this is really something that kind of followed them in from last year into this year. They were not a very good hitting team last year. And I think that's kind of, again, bothered them into this season. Hopefully they can shake that off. And as we get into the, deeper part of the MLB season this year and deeper part into the summer, that can change a little bit. And they can kind of get into a little bit of a better rhythm hitting-wise, because they have not looked good at all, in my personal opinion. So getting into another game, the next one, Padres and Pirates. Padres winning 6-2. Padres started off scoring the first run of the game in the top of the first, 1-0. Pittsburgh did follow it up and tied things up at the bottom of the third with a run, but then the Padres put up 2 back-to-back innings of 2 or more runs. So top 6, they put up 3 runs, and then top 7, they put up 2 runs. Pittsburgh only put up 1 more run in the bottom of the 8th, and that was it. Padres amassed 10 total hits. Again, a really big day for Will Myers, 3 hits, 5 RBI games. So he's really, again, credited with 5 of those 6 runs. That's pretty impressive. And not to mention, it's a really good sign that this Padres team has not seemed to skip a beat with Fernando Tatis still injured. And we don't know when he's going to be back. He could be out for the entire season. I have read many reports where he could be out for the entirety of this year. And if he is, well, that's going to be a problem. But at the same time, it might not be because of how well this team has picked up. I mean, just looking at some of the hitting numbers, Jake Cronenworth, 2 for 5 from the plate. Then you've got Manny Machado. He was 1 for 4, not that great, but still pretty decent. Then you have Will Myers, who went 3 for 5 with 5 RBIs, batting .350. If you've got a guy that's able to do that and pick up the slack when your star player is out, that's a really good sign. That's a really, really good sign. But then looking at the Pirates, I mean, I was watching the Pirates game the other day with a buddy of mine, and Pittsburgh guy, huge Pirates guy. He's now actually starting to root a little bit for the Red Sox because he's sick and tired of the Pirates. And I actually have a lot of other friends that are kind of doing the same thing. I've got one buddy that's kind of starting to root for the Rays now because he's tired of the Pirates. And that's kind of a sad thing if you're the Pittsburgh Pirates, that you've got fans that are actually starting to not root for your team and going and rooting for other teams. That's a really, and again, these are people that are lifelong Pittsburghers. They have been here their entire lives. They've been fans of all teams in the city their entire lives. And, I mean, the Pirates, I mean, you don't even know half the guys on this team. I was watching the game with him, and he goes, I don't even know half these guys. I've never heard of any of these players. And they do get these rent-a players, these kind of one-year deal players that, you can pay $650,000 to, and that's that, and they're there for a year or two. They stink up the joint. They're not very good. And then all of a sudden, you're kind of back to square one with an entirely new personnel. So hopefully the Pirates down the road can figure things out because it's not looking really good for them. But getting into another game, a little rematch from opening day, Yankees and Blue Jays. Yankees getting their revenge, winning 3-1 over the Blue Jays. Toronto did get things going first. They scored in the bottom of the first, and then the Yankees put up 2 runs in the top of the 5th and 1 in the top of the 8th, and that was really all she wrote for the Blue Jays. Blue Jays right now are sitting at 4-6. So a little bit of a slower start for the Blue Jays than I would have expected. Marcus Semien, he was 1 for 4 from the plate. Bo Bichette was 1 for 3. Vlad Jr. was 1 for 4 as well. And then going over for the Yankees, again, a lot of blanks, I'd have to say, in terms of the hits. I mean, they only amassed 4 total hits, and they were getting it from the bottom of their lineup. Ruffin Odor was 1 for 3. And, I mean, it was kind of a quiet, game for the Yankees in terms of just runs and also production. I mean, only 5 hits for the Blue Jays and 4 hits for the Yankees. So, again, great pitching from Garrett Cole. I mean, he picked up the win, 2-0 on the year now, a 1.47 ERA. Another guy that's a former Pirate, like I mentioned in the first segment, like Joe Musgrove. They leave, they go somewhere else, and all of a sudden, they're a completely different player, a totally different player. So, I don't know what it is with that. But getting into the next game, Rangers, Rays winning in a close one, 1-0. And quite frankly, this is, again, going to be a constant theme for the Rays. Tyler Glasnow picked up the win, 1-0 on the year, .46 ERA, struck out 14. They rely on their pitching so heavily, it's incredible to watch. They rely so heavily on their pitching, on their defense, because a team that is just, this is not the first time this year that they've won games where it's 1-0 or 2-1, and they're really, really, close ball games, but they're being helped out a lot by their pitching. They're being helped out a lot by their defense, and it's not really the hitting that's bailing them out at all. I mean, they only had 3 hits the entire game. Austin Meadows was 1 for 2. He had 2 walks. He struck out 1 time, and then Brandon Phillips was 1 for 2, and Willy Adames was 1 for 3. Willy Adames scored the only RBI. He's the only one that knocked in the RBI. He actually had a home run in the 7th inning on an 0-2 count. And, again, that was it. And, I mean, how can you continue? And that's the thing is I although I think the Rays are very good, I do question whether or not if they had had a full season last year, if that 40-20 start through 60 games would have kept up and been the same pace for 162 games. Because let's face it, you're not going to get this lucky all the time winning games 1-0. I mean, maybe you do, but I just think that their lack of offensive threat and kind of their lack of offensive production, it's going to come back to bite them. I don't think that the way they win is a durable and kind of a longevity style of winning, if you will, because I think that, the pitching is going to get rocked one day. The defense is not going to be great one day. And if their hitting can't bail them out, which it's clearly shown that they don't really get bailed out by their hitting, then it's going to be a really, really long season, I think. But again, Tampa Bay is off to a decent start. They're 5-5 right now, so maybe they can figure things out with just the pitching and hitting. We'll have to see. Getting to the next game, Marlins and Braves. This one actually wrapped up in 10 innings. And Miami started things off. I mean, Atlanta scored in the first inning, bottom one, and then Miami followed up with a run of their own in the top of the second, and then Atlanta came back in the bottom of the third and scored. And it was pretty quiet for most of the game after that. I mean, 4, 5, and 6 innings, they were no scores. Bottom 7, Atlanta goes and puts up another run on the board, so now they're up 3-1. And then Miami actually put up a 2-run spot in the top of the 8th, and then wound up putting up 2 more runs in the top of the 10th. Miami had 8 hits to Atlanta's 4, and it was a great, probably back and forth. Again, I did not get to watch this one, but I mean, I would always... being able to watch an extra inning game is great, and not to mention, I actually do enjoy that they're starting at second base at the beginning of these extra inning games, because it does make things a little bit more exciting, and the game does only go to 10 or maybe 11 or maybe 12 innings, and there is some beauty in the 18-inning games, but at the same time, people don't want to watch that. I want to watch that, but that's not everybody, and that's the thing, is that the MLB has to appeal to everybody, and the everyday fan that's just scrolling through the TV wanting to catch a game, they're not going to sit and watch an 18-inning pitcher's duel that's still 0-0 through the entire game. Nobody's going to watch that. They want some excitement. They want some action on the base paths, and that's exactly what the MLB is doing, putting a guy at second base, starting out the extra innings with it. It makes things interesting, and then the other team goes up and can do the same thing. I mean, sometimes you might have an extra inning game extended, further on, but sometimes you might not. Sometimes it might just take one swing, and that's all she wrote in the extras. But again, a really, really great win by Miami after Atlanta got, I think, a very brutal and questionable loss on Sunday against the Phillies. Again, a call that I don't quite understand how they kind of were able to not overturn that safe call by Alec Boehm. I mean, Boehm was out by, I don't even think he touched the plate. He literally didn't even touch the plate. And all of a sudden they get, a run scores. They get called safe. And the Braves are on the unfortunate end of that one. But again, that was on Sunday. So getting back into the Monday games, now we're getting into the Nationals-Cardinals game. Nationals that are actually really struggling, 2-5 this year. But they did pick up a win over the Cardinals, 5-2. They scored in the first inning, and then they also put up some runs in the 6th inning, the 7th inning, and the 8th inning. I mean, a really great day from Andrew Stevenson, a pinch hit home run out of Andrew Stevenson. And he's somebody that the Nationals, I think, are really hoping that he develops into something special. Same with Kaboom. And I think Carter Kaboom and Andrew Stevenson are both players that maybe down the road they could be future pieces for this Washington Nationals team, but they haven't really proved it yet, right? And again, for the Nationals, though, they're getting a lot of help from none other than Mr. Juan Soto, 3 for 4 with 1 RBI, 1 walk, only struck out 1 time. He's batting .375. Juan Soto is having an insane season, to say the least. An insane season. 2 home runs, 5 RBIs, and 1,100 OPS. 1.125 to be exact. This guy, I think, is going to have a better career than Fernando Tatis. Call me crazy, but I definitely could see that. I mean, this guy has got some serious power. He's got some serious hitting ability. I will say Fernando Tatis beats him out with the defense because Juan Soto is a terrible defender. And I hate to say that because I think he's a great player. He's just not a very good defender. But then going over into the Cardinals, kind of looking at through some of their numbers, Yadier Molina got a hit, 1 for 4 from the plate. Paul DeJong was 1 for 4 from the plate. Matt Carpenter went 1 for 2. And again, the Cardinals, this is just one game for them. They've actually been off to a pretty solid start, 5-5 so far. But I think that NL Central is going to be interesting. That NL Central is going to be very, very interesting for the rest of the season to kind of see where teams land and wind up and whatnot. But then getting into the next game from Monday, Tigers and Astros. Tigers actually picking up a big win, 6-2 over the Stros. They scored in the 2nd and 3rd inning. Both scored 2 runs then, and then the Tigers also put up 2 runs in the top of the 5th. Houston did put up 2 runs at the end of the game, one in the 8th and one in the 9th. So that's the thing with Houston. They are a late inning team. They will start to wake up later into the game, later into the innings, and that's when they really start to kind of pile on the runs. And I think that's what's made them so good, is that they're a durable team that can perform throughout any part of the game and throughout any part, whether it's the 8th inning or the 1st inning, they can still be as dangerous as they are throughout the entirety of the game. But then just running through some numbers, Michael Brantley was 1 for 4 from the plate. Then looking at, actually, Uriel had a very, very good day from the plate, 3 for 4. And Detroit did have 12 hits. Houston only had 7, and 3 of those hits, 3 of those 7 hits for Houston were from Gurriel. And he's having a great year, too, batting .400. So he's somebody that's having a great season so far. But then going over to the Tigers, looking at Heimer Candelario, he's off to a great start. I mean, batting .270, but he went 2 for 3 from the plate against the Astros. So again, a really good sign that a young player like Heimer Candelario starting to make a little bit more noise, starting to come up through the ranks, and I think he's going to be a really good player for the Tigers. Next game, Angels, Royals, and man, the Angels have come bursting out of the gates all of a sudden. Won 10-3 over the Royals, who are actually also having a really, really good season as well. They're 4-4. But Shohei Ohtani, he was a monster in this one. 3-hit game, 3 RBIs, and the Angels, they just poured on the runs throughout the entire game. I mean, they sprinkled 2 runs in the top of the 2nd, then they put up 1 in the top of the 3rd, 1 in the top of the 5th, and then all of a sudden they put 3 in the top of the 7th and 3 in the top of the 9th. 14 hits and scored 10 runs on those 14 hits. Talk about conversion. I mean, that's a great conversion rate. You're not leaving many men on base, and that's a good sign. That's a really good sign of a team that can, again, if you leave a lot of guys on base, but you can get a lot of guys on base, it doesn't really do you any good. But if you get a lot of guys on base and you score them, you're going to be a dangerous team. That's where I think it kind of is the difference between good teams and great teams. Teams that are able to put on a lot of guys on base but then score them, as opposed to just putting them on and only scoring a couple. If you can really pile on the runs, that is, again, what makes you a different team from just those good teams. So a great win by the Angels. But then getting into the last few games, Indians and White Sox. White Sox picked up a big win, 4-3. Actually, an Adam Eaton huge home run in the bottom of the 9th that actually was the go-ahead, Adam Eaton with the 3-run homer in the bottom of the 3rd that will put them up ahead 3-2 over the Indians. Cleveland scored 1 run in the bottom of the 6th, and then all of a sudden in the bottom of the 9th, they walked it off. A huge, huge win for the White Sox. Eddie Rosario had a 2-run homer for the Indians, and quite frankly, I think that's the one maybe bright shining spot for the Indians, is they have somebody like Eddie Rosario in the outfield that can hit, because they have a terrible hitting outfield. They had it last year, they had it the year before, and they really had it since I think Michael Brantley left the team, and that really kind of took away a lot of offense from the outfield. But nonetheless, I think it was a great sign that they were able to get some help from a guy like Eddie Rosario, and they were able to go out and get somebody like that. So then getting into the next 2 games, Athletics and D-backs. Athletics winning 9-5, putting up a huge, huge game there. 2 runs in the top of the 3rd, 3 in the top of the 5th, and 2 in the top of the 9th. They're 4-7 this year, just like the D-backs. And then the last game, Reds, Giants. Reds winning 3-0. Again, another team like the Angels who have really kind of surprised, I think, a lot of people. They're 7-3 right now, won 3-0. Giants are 6-4, so they're off to a pretty good start as well. Joey Votto had a big home run. Cincinnati scored 2 runs in the top of the 3rd, 1 in the top of the 6th. And again, that was it for the Monday games. The Red Sox and Twins were postponed. Mariners and Orioles was postponed. And then same thing with the Phillies and the Mets. But just going through the standings right now, just letting everyone know who's in first and whatnot. In the Central, we've got Cincinnati sitting at first place in 7-3. Now we go down to the NL East. Phillies are sitting at 6-3 in first place. And in the West, the Dodgers are 8-2 sitting in first place. But the Padres are right behind them. They're 8-3. So they're nipping at their heels. And that's probably going to be a constant theme throughout the rest of the season. Then getting in the AL East, Red Sox are now sitting at first place after a sluggish start, 6-3 on the season. In the Central, the Indians actually kind of been the most surprising team. They're 5-4 sitting in first place, but the Twins are 5-4 and the White Sox are 5-5. And then you also have to look at the Royals, who are 4-4. So again, kind of a logjam atop the leaderboard there. So we'll have to see how that one plays out. And then the AL West, the Angels are 7-3, sitting at first place, and the Astros trail them they're 6-4 this year. The Astros are. And the Oakland Athletics, I mean, they've really struggled. 4-7 this year. Not a great start for them, but hopefully they can figure things out. Again, it's pretty early on in the season, so there's no need to panic quite yet. But I think as we get closer into the All-Star game and kind of towards, the middle of July and whatnot, if this is a trend that continues on in Oakland, you got to make some moves, I think. I think of Oakland, they play it very safe a lot of the times, and they do get, I think, every ounce of ability out of every player that they possibly have. But at the same time, guys like Matt Olson, guys like Matt Chapman, they can't underperform. And I feel like this athletics team, they have so much to offer, but they just don't put it all together. And I feel like they're not aggressive enough to make themselves that kind of championship contending team because they've got great pitching. And I think they've got great management, and I think that they are a well-ran team. It's just a matter of them getting other pieces that can help them out and not trading for an Elvis Andrus who's batting under 100 on the year. I mean, that's not going to help your case at all. So, again, games running through the Monday. Again, I'm recording this on Tuesday, so I just went through the games from Monday, April 12th. But again, a lot of great games, and I'm really excited for the rest of the games this week and getting into the weekend. But folks, that will close things out here for us in our second segment on the GSMC Baseball Podcast. Thanks again for tuning in. Coming up after the commercial, I'll get into sharing each AL West team's MVP and what kind of seasons they need to have to help their team's success this season. It's been a lot of fun so far, but we've got a lot more to go, so don't change that channel. We'll be right back here on the GSMC Baseball Podcast.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be, visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to the GSMC Baseball Podcast. Great to have you all here still with me today. Jack Ridenauer again. And in the previous segment, I jumped into some of the recaps from Monday night's games and discussed where teams are standing right now in the MLB, some major performances from some players and all the sort. But I want to now dive into chatting about the AL West teams' respective MVPs for those teams and what kind of seasons they need to have for their team to have this much success and have a lot of, really a good chance of going into the playoffs and maybe even going further into maybe the Fall Classic or the World Series, whatever it might be. So getting into it, just running through the AL West, as always, the Astros, Athletics, Angels, Mariners, and Rangers. And starting off with the Astros. Now, this might be somewhat of an unconventional MVP because I think a lot of people will just say, oh, Jose Altuve or Yuli Gurriel or whoever it might be. I'm going to go with Carlos Correa. I think Carlos Correa could be this team's MVP. I mean, he puts up insane numbers, right? I mean, he's already got a couple of home runs this year, batting well above 300. And not to mention, I think that this is going to be a year that he puts the pedal to the metal and really continues on with a good solid amount of momentum into the season that he's already picked up right now because of this upcoming impending offseason he has with his free agency. And his contract will be up, and so he'll be back out on the free agency market. I think that he's got to have a really good season. I'm not saying he has to have necessarily an actual MVP season, right? I mean, I'm not saying that these players are the MVP for the league. They're the MVP of their team that they need to be for this season. And I think that he has to still be very good. I think he's got to have at least somewhat of an all-star caliber season. And I think that if he wants to really put himself and separate himself from others in the shortstop class for next offseason, I think that this is a huge, huge, huge time for him right now. And not to mention, let's look at this Astros team, right? Gurriel is going to be somebody that's going to hit pretty well. Jose Altuve, though, he does hit well, but at times, and we saw it last year, he does go through a little bit of a slump every now and again. Michael Brantley is getting a little bit older. They've had some help with having Kyle Tucker hit over 400. He's got I think he's got over four home runs right now. So he's off to a great start. But if you look at how Carlos Correa fits into that team, he's an incredible middle-of-the-lineup hitter. And if you have, again, some guys slumping on this team, I think that they're going to really fall back onto Carlos Correa and say, hey, we need not only your bat, but also your glove. He's a good fielder. And so I think that Correa has to have a really solid season and really put up some good numbers in order for them, or the Astros, to actually have a good year, but also for Carlos Correa to catch a little bit more attention and have a little bit more attention come his way. So I'm definitely looking to see how Carlos Correa continues to move forward into the season. But now getting into the Athletics, I think a player that they need to have at least a really good season and be that team's MVP, and this is for the Athletics, they really need to have Matt Chapman be their MVP. I really do believe that. I think that Matt Chapman is somebody that has, for whatever reason, continued to underperform. And as a result, I think that there's been years where he's been really good, but then there's been years where he was really, really bad. And last year was one of them. And I feel that, and I also fear that with this Athletics team, they're only, I would say, a step or two ahead of the Rays, of what the Rays are, a team that, again, prides itself on defense and really good pitching. The Athletics, though, they have some good hitting. They've got guys that can definitely put the ball in play and be effective from the plate. And I think that Chapman is one of those guys, and he really has to have a good year. He really, really, really needs to have a good year in order for them to, I think, be any sort of competitive. I mean, right now they're sitting towards the bottom of the AL West, somewhere that they have not really found themselves in the last year or so, in the last 2 years, really. And Chapman is not hitting well at all. He's batting 179 this year. He's having a really, really bad season. And last year it was the same thing. Batted 232. He had 10 homers. He had 25 RBIs. He had an 812 OPS. But then the difference for this year is that, he's got 2 home runs. He's got 5 RBIs, but he's got a 600 OPS. So a huge drop-off from his power numbers, where you look at that stat line, you say, okay, I can ignore the batting average a little bit. I can look at the OPS. Matt Chapman needs to be the big difference because, again, if you look at this team, for the most part, they don't really have a whole lot of hitting, and I think that Chapman is kind of looked at as one of the better hitters on this team and somebody that is, again, a formidable hitter and somebody that's a feared hitter. And I think that he's got to have an all-star caliber season. I mean, he's got to turn this 179 batting average right around to a 279 or a 289 batting average because, again, I do fear that because of the season he's coming off of, and he was injured towards the latter part of the season, so he was a little bit nicked up. I think that if you have a similar kind of outcome with Chapman where he does not hit great, he's injured, that's going to put a lot of pressure on Matt Olson. Matt Olson is not hitting much better than Chapman, batting 226, and he's coming off of a really big hip injury from last year. So those are their kind of main, I would say, focal points, and for them to both be hitting sub 250, that's unacceptable, and it clearly speaks to why they are not very good right now. And so I think that Chapman has to turn things around, especially if they want to have any sort of shot into the playoffs. Now, getting into the Angels, I think this is a very obvious one. There's no question about it. Mike Trout is their MVP. You cannot argue that at all. There is no way that you can argue that he's not their MVP. And the Angels are off to a great start. I mean, they are off to a really, really good start. 7-3 on the year right now. And I think that this might be a season that things get turned around. I will say, though, he needs to have his typical season. He needs to be the typical Mike Trout that we all know. And again, if you look at their numbers right now, he's leading the team in average with a 394 average and 4 home runs. And I think that Trout has to really step up the play and continue to play the way he has his entire career. Because, again, looking at that team, Shohei Ohtani, he's had injuries in the past. Dexter Fowler, he's out right now, if I'm not mistaken, for majority of the season, if not the whole season. Anthony Rendon last year started off very slow. Jose Iglesias is a new piece to see, and we'll see how he continues to mesh. And I think that Trout is the glue that holds it all together. And if he does not have a good season, that's when the unraveling happens. And I really do believe that because I think a lot of the players on that team, and rightfully so, I feel, they kind of go into it with, okay, we know that Mike Trout is going to bail us out every now and again. We're going to get help from Trout. He's going to be a really big piece for us. And he's going to be one of the most impactful players that really plays the game. And I feel that he's got to be really, really good. And I think that they need him now more than ever. I mean, I really do believe that because they've been so atrocious the last few years. And I'm going to get into it actually in my next segment where I'm going to discuss whether or not I think that Mike Trout could come back this year after if they're not able to make the playoffs or not. And again, I think that he needs to be the Mike Trout that we've seen before. He needs to be an MVP caliber player in order for this Angels team to stay afloat, but also to be competitive. And it's unfortunate because, this is not a hard division, right? I mean, this is not a hard division. The Rangers are not great. The Mariners are not great. The Athletics aren't very good this year. And I think now the Angels have kind of taken that role from the Athletics as that kind of foil for the Astros. And I think that's why Mike Trout's going to be so big, because there's nobody else in the AL West that is Mike Trout. The Angels have a luxury that no other team in the MLB has, and that is they have probably the best player in baseball on their team. So I would say let's use that to your advantage a little bit. And I think that if Trout has an MVP caliber year, and if he is this team's MVP, he is their best player, I think the sky is the limit for the Angels, because I think other players will follow in suit. And I definitely think that the pitching is going to start figuring itself out slowly but surely. So now getting into the Rangers. Now this is going to be an interesting MVP to select. I'm going to go with Nate Lowe. And the reason why I'm going with Nate is because I've been very impressed with him early on. I know he's not hitting it for a great average right now, but in terms of his run production and in terms of his just overall offensive production, he's got 3 homers this year, and he's got 14 RBIs. The next closest is 6 on the Rangers. So there's an 8 RBI difference between first and second place. That should tell you a lot, especially about how big of an impact Lowe has had so far. I think that this team, they're looking for an answer. I think they're desperately looking for an answer. I think we saw it in the offseason. They made some interesting, subtle moves, and I think that they were trying to slap something together. You know, they go out and they trade Elvis Andrus over to the Athletics for Chris Davis, so you get some power to surround with Joey Gallo. You get someone like Nate Lowe, who's also going to be some power as well. David Dahl, somebody else who's, I think, a very good baseball player that people, I don't think, really appreciate as much. And so as a result, I think that Lowe's got to be, like Trout, that piece that brings it all together. And having the amount of run production that he has put up this year and being responsible, again, for 14 of their runs so far, and again, we're only about 10 games into the season, I think that he's got to be the difference for them. He really does. Because if you look at their pitching is not that stellar, right? Mike Foltynewicz leads their team in ERA, and he's got a 4.09 ERA. So right there, that's telling you a problem is starting to brew, and that is their issues on the mound. And I think that Lowe can get them out of situations with his bat and with his ability to hit, and with his ability to hit for a lot of power, too. That's the other thing. He can hit for a lot of power, so all you really need is a couple guys to get on base, and Lowe steps up, and all of a sudden, he's driving in guys left and right. And I think I remember when they made this move to get him, and I was a little questionable of it. I said, I don't really understand why they went after him. He didn't have great numbers in Tampa, but now I see why. He's got a lot of power potential. And if you've got a guy that is able to do that, it's going to allow a lot of things to happen, right? I mean, Joey Gallo's batting .233. They don't have great hitting. I mean, Lau's at .211. But again, if he's going to produce the runs that he's already started to produce, then there's no question he's got to be their MVP. There's no question. He's got to be the difference for them. He's got to be that main piece of offense, because if the other guys can do their role, I think Lau can do the rest. Well, getting into my last team, the Seattle Mariners. I actually have 2 players that I think could be their MVPs. I think Ty France could be, and I also think Kyle Lewis could be. And I'm a huge Kyle Lewis fan. I think that Kyle Lewis does a wonderful job. I know that Kyle Lewis is a little nicked up right now, a little banged up. He's not currently playing a whole lot right now. And as a result, that does kind of affect things for the Mariners. But Ty France has been off to an incredible start, batting .324 this year, leads the team in average. He's got 1 home run, 4 RBIs, a .910 OPS. And again, he's 26 years old. So very similar to Kyle Lewis, young, budding superstar. And I think that I have to give it to both of them because, again, they're both just as vital to their team. You could even throw in Jared Kalenic. You could even throw in Kyle Seager, these other players that they have. And when I rattle those names off, people might not know all of these names with like Kalenic and France. But these are players I think that are going to start becoming household names sooner rather than later. And I think that if they want people to take them serious, if you will, and to look at them as an actual competitor and an actual contender, I would say this. They need guys like France. They need guys like Kalenic to step up because everybody knows what Kyle Lewis and Kyle Seager can do. Everybody knows what they can do, right? Kyle Seager has put up good numbers in the past. Kyle Lewis is coming off a Rookie of the Year season. So it's really France and Kalenic that have a lot to prove, but I think that France and Lewis can be this team's MVP. I don't know if they're going to make the playoffs. I really am skeptical of that. I don't know if they have the depth and the personnel that can take them this far and this long into the season without something possibly come crashing down, right? I feel like at some point or another, They do need to be a little bit aggressive. They need to go out and get another player, or they need somebody to just step up and hit. Evan White, I'm literally directing that at him because he's a great fielder. Was won a Gold Glove before at first base, but he's not a great hitter. He's not a good hitter. And having a guy at first base that can't hit, I mean, that's not a good sign at all. Sure, he's a great fielder, but if he can't hit, that's taken away half of what he's capable of doing. And so at the end of the day, I think that France or Lewis could either both or one of them have to be the MVP for this team. And like I said, for the Rangers, Lau needs to be that MVP, Trout for the Angels, Chapman for the Athletics, Correa for the Astros. And again, I'm not saying that they need to be the MVPs of the league. I just need them to be MVPs of their teams, of their respective teams, in order for their team to be successful this season. And I think that if those guys can put it together, Correa, I mean, what he does what he does that a lot of these other guys that I mentioned can't do, he can hit in the playoffs. And that's where he separates himself personally. And so that's why I think that, again, Correa needs to have a really good year, because if they get into the playoffs, I think that's when we're going to see a whole step above of what Correa can do this regular season in the playoffs, because he's just so much better in the playoffs. And he's a great hitter. I mean, he's one of the better power-hitting shortstops. Chapman's one of the better power-hitting third basemen. He's really good. He just can't seem to put it all together. And then Trout, we know what he can do. And Lau, he's been impressing, I would say, people early on. And then France and Lewis, I think, again, they've got a little bit more to prove. Not as much as Lewis, but or not as much as France does. I think Lewis has already kind of proven to people what he can do. But nonetheless, these teams are very interesting. This is a very interesting division because we've already started to see a little changing around with now the Angels and the Astros being atop the leaderboard instead of the Athletics and the Astros. So we'll see if that sticks true and stays true throughout the remainder of the season. But those are the players that I think in the AL West on those teams that they need to be their team's respective MVPs. I really do believe that. So that'll do it for this segment, folks. As always, thanks for sticking around, but stay right there because we'll be right back after this commercial break for the final segment today, where I'll get into a buy it or deny it, discussing whether I buy or deny the idea that if the Angels don't make the playoffs this year, Mike Trout will demand a trade after the season. Don't go anywhere, everyone, because we have one last segment here on the GSMC Baseball Podcast.
Want to know the latest in soccer? Then listen to the Golden State Media Concepts Soccer Podcast. From MLS, the World Cup, and the Premier League, we've got you covered. The latest updates, the hottest matches, and news on the league's top players. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Soccer Podcast.
David Beckham scores the goal to take England all the way to the World Cup final.
Listen now.
Hey everyone, and welcome back to the final segment here on the GSMC Baseball Podcast. Jack Ridenauer still with you. And in the previous segment, I got into sharing the AL West team's MVPs and sharing which team's MVPs I think need to have the best season this year for their respective teams to ensure a playoff run either this year or in the future. But I want to now close things out today with a buy it or deny it and discuss whether I buy or deny the idea that if the Angels don't make the playoffs this year, then Mike Trout will demand a trade in the offseason. So as we know, Mike Trout has probably had the toughest time in his career getting to the playoffs, and he's probably, across all sports, one of the greatest athletes in their respective sport ever to not have the amount of playoff experience or really the amount of playoff success that other greats across the sports landscape have had in the past. So that is something to also factor in, right? Mike Trout is somebody that we've seen do incredible things, unthinkable things. He's won MVPs, he's been an all-star each and every single season, so on and so forth, and he's been to one playoff appearance. Just throwing out some numbers for you all. Angels, they've had 5 straight seasons of being below 500. They haven't had a winning record since 2015, and they've only had, again, one season in Trout's entire career starting in 2011 where they had more than 90 wins, and they only had one playoff appearance. Right? They went to the ALDS in 2014. They lost in 3 games to none to the Royals. So that tells you, again, something else is kind of an issue, because if in a 10-year career, a guy that has won MVPs 30% of the time in those 10 years, right, 3 MVPs, then how is he not able to help his team out? How is he not able to guide his team all the way to the playoffs? And this is why. Baseball is a sport where you can't rely on one person. It's not like basketball where it's like, okay, if we've got this one guy, we'll probably be okay. Can't do that. That is not how you're going to win. That is not how you're going to win at all. And so as a result, I feel that at times what's been the issue is that the Angels were like, okay, we've got this incredible once-in-a-lifetime talent. We don't really need a whole lot else. We're fine. And I know that they had some issues with injuries along the way, and they had some issues with just players not playing the way they should. And again, Shohei Ohtani, let's face it, the last 2 years he's been pretty banged up. And as a result, that really takes away a big part of what they are now, kind of, right? I mean, Ohtani has literally kind of become the sidekick to Mike Trout right now in terms of just the production and the amount of just help that he brings for the Angels. And I worry that as time continues on, again, Mike Trout's 29, he'll be 30 in August. So, again, in a 10-year MLB career, 11-year MLB career, he's gone to the playoffs one time, and he's been swept in those playoffs. And he's kind of getting into that age where you're getting into your 30s. He definitely still has probably about at least 5 or 6 good years left in him, at least. He's got a whole second half of his career to play. And so I wonder if in that second half of his career, he will wind up going somewhere else. He will wind up wanting a trade. He'll wind up wanting to get out, and he'll wind up wanting to be on a contending team. Because let's face it, he's in an ideal location. Los Angeles, there's nothing wrong with Los Angeles, especially if you're making the amount of money he's making. Rent payments, probably not a whole lot. Mortgage payments, probably not a whole lot in his eyes. So the question will be, where would he go if he were to ask for a trade? And the other thing is he the type of individual to demand a trade? I don't think he is. He has not necessarily portrayed that quite yet. He has not shown that he is somebody that is going to become upset, disgruntled, and want to, have a change of scenery and want to trade. He doesn't really throw me as that type of individual. However, we have to remind ourselves that there have been players in the past that weren't necessarily outspoken about wanting to be traded, who wound up getting traded. And as a result, I think that's something to factor in. He could not say a word, and then he might be quietly talking to management saying, I'd like to get out of here. I'd like to have a change of scenery. I'd like to trade, and I'd like to be on a contending team that is going to actually perform well. I will say this, though. They're off to a great start. So that is something to pay attention to. That is something to pay close attention to, is how they performed this year. I think that this year, if it's not this year, it's definitely in the next year or two, because there's no way that Mike Trout is going to spend his entire career in L.A. and he's going to go to one playoff appearance. I mean, that is ridiculous. At some point, especially in the day and age that we are in with sports, where players are now being able to get out of contracts and being able to, start forcing trades, if you will, just because of their, unhappiness, disgruntlement, whatever it might be. It's very possible for him to do that. He can clearly do that. There's no question about it at all. And I think now it's just a matter of, can the Angels put together a winning team? Right now, it looks like they have. It looks like they have. But at the same time, it's 10 games into the season. We're not even a whole month into the year, and we could have a lot of things change. Now, just some kind of interesting ideas to throw around at people. He's from New Jersey. So could we ever see him head back east? Could we see him being on a team like the Mets? Right? I mean, he's an individual that for most teams, or for certain teams, if he's added to that team, I think it could be classified as the first ever baseball super team by far. Right? If you add him to the Dodgers, the Padres, the White Sox, the Mets, any of those teams, those are super teams all of a sudden because of what he brings to the table and also the personnel that is already on that team. So it brings me to this point of, could he want to form some sort of super team? Could he just want to say, hey, you know what, I just want to win this World Series and get it over with and get it off my chest? Because everybody, I think, is expecting him to do that. I think everybody is expecting him to cross that off of his career list. And at a point, it's got to start aggravating him. At a point, it's got to start kicking in and saying, man, I have not made it anywhere past the ALDS, and I've won 3 MVPs, and I've been to 10 All-Star games, I've won numerous Gold Gloves, I've won numerous Silver Sluggers. How is this not happening? But he doesn't really throw me as that type of person. He doesn't really throw me as somebody that is going to want to just kind of jump ship and say, hey, I'm out of here. I'm going to go on the other team, and I'm going to go and win and try and build something special there. He seems to want to stick around because he's stuck around pretty long. Now, I know he's on a very long contract. I know that contract at some point or another is going to be up. And we've seen players in very recent memory, like Nolan Arenado, who, although he signed a huge extension, he was still able to get out of it. He was still able to get traded. And so as a result, it is not a far-fetched idea, I don't think. I think that it could be something where if Trout does not make the playoffs, then I could see him saying, okay, you know what, I'm out of here. I am tired of it. I do not want to deal with this anymore. I'm tired of losing. I'm tired of coming up short. And I'm tired of the Angels not building a good enough team around me. He seems to be a pretty humble guy, so maybe that's not necessarily the thinking. But I do think that the clock is ticking, right? I mean, the clock is literally ticking. Last year was the worst season in the Trout era for the Angels. Worst season, winning percentage-wise. And again, I think a lot of it does come from not only just the lack of support around him, but the lack of pitching. I mean, Dylan Bundy right now leads the team in a 3.75 ERA, and after that, it just balloons to 7. And I don't really see how he could legitimately want to stick around on a team that is going to give him no help, no run support. And not to mention, this is what's also very aggravating, is that it's not a hard division. It's not a hard couple teams that they have to get by, right? The Angels, I mean, the Rangers and the Mariners, I feel right now, they're teams that they have no shot, right? I mean, maybe they do this year, but they don't really seem to be where they need to be right now in terms of the development of a franchise. The Astros, on the other hand, I think that their time is also starting to wind down. I personally think that as time goes on, they're going to start losing guys, they're going to start losing pieces, and soon enough, it'll be back to kind of square one with where the Astros were so many years ago. The Athletics, I don't know what to think of them because, again, they're a team that is going to, again, kind of do this very strategic building of a team instead of just trying to go with what might be best and so on and so forth. I think they listen to the analytics just a little bit too much. But the Angels, they don't have a whole bunch of competition. It's not like they're in the NL East where they've got 3 or 4 teams that could literally win the division. It's not like it's the AL West where there's other teams that are pretty legit and they at least give some competition to one another, and they have other players. They have those teams have, each team has players that can definitely, hold their own. So it just makes me wonder, okay, what's going to give? Is there anything that's going to give? Is Mike Trout, the greatest baseball player arguably in this generation, going to actually spend an entire career with one team that makes it to the playoffs one time and is swept in the ALDS? I really don't believe that. I really don't. I hate to say that because I think that it's great that a team like the Angels, not a team like the Dodgers or the Yankees or the Cubs, has a player like Trout on their team. I think that is incredible for the game. I think it shows that anybody can be capable of coming across one of a once-in-a-lifetime talent. It is not necessarily always the team with the most money. There's other instances of it where, you do get lucky in a draft or whatever. So that is kind of exciting to see. But at the same time, I think he's got a legacy to uphold, right? He's a player that needs to at least go towards at least an ALCS or maybe even just make it to the World Series, go to the playoffs at least a couple more times in his career. I'm not saying it's going to change how he's viewed in all-time baseball history, but in terms of his legacy and if he wants to be known as a player that, yeah, he was a great player on the field, he was incredible, and he won. You can't really say that right now. I mean, and the other thing is that they actually started off pretty well through the first couple years of his career. I mean, consistent 500-plus winning seasons. And then after 2015, it just kind of nosedives into under 500, under 200, or under 400. Not great winning percentages at all. And so at some point, I think something's got to give. I think that something needs to happen. And maybe this is the year. Maybe this is finally the year where they figure it out and they say, hey, you know what, we've got this guy. We've surrounded him with good talent now. We went out and got Anthony Rendon last year. We got Jose Iglesias this year. We've got guys that are coming up through the ranks like Joe Adell, who hopefully is able to put it together more than he did last year. We went out and added some pitching. We've got a decent team. We've built a decent team, and then Shohei Ohtani's back. And having him back is always going to be incredibly helpful because he can pitch and he can hit. I just think that at some point, if he's not making it by his 33rd year, 34th year, and, come year 13 and 14 into the MLB, if he has not made it to the playoffs at all, I think that he's got to have a conversation that might be uncomfortable with management. I really do believe that, as much as it pains me to say that, because I don't have any problem with the Angels, and I, quite frankly, am a big fan of Mike Trout. I like Mike Trout. I think he's a great player. I think him and Mookie Betts, who is another player that I'm a big fan of, are the two best players in baseball all around. I really do believe that. And luckily for Mookie Betts, he's been on really good teams who have won, right? And that's just kind of how the cookie crumbles. And for Mike Trout, again, but what he can do in his advantage is that he does have leverage. He can say, hey, I'm the best baseball player, arguably the best baseball player in baseball right now, and we've been to one playoff since I've been here. What gives? If you're not going to try and win, if you're not going to build a successful team, I'm out of here. And so my ultimate decision on this is, yeah, I do buy it. I do think that he'll be out of here. If it's not this offseason, it's the next offseason if they don't make the playoffs. I really do. I think last year was kind of a throwaway year, and I think he was kind of saying, you know what, I'm going to let this one slide. We've got this pandemic. We've got 60 games. There's not a whole lot we can do. It's a mad dash to the finish. So we're going to just kind of play it as it is. This is, I think, the test. I think this year and going into next year, I think it's going to be a big test. And then after next year, I'll put it to you this way. If he does not make the playoffs, and if they finish under 500 at least next season, he's gone. He's gone. There's no question about it. Again, there's only so much you can do. There's only so much that you can try and figure out in order to correct the problem. But once it's not corrected, it's like, and nothing is changing, it's like, okay, well, then I need to just go somewhere else. I just need to get out of here. And I think that it's going to happen at some point or another. I don't know when, but I think that it's a conversation that is slowly but surely going to start happening eventually. And I wouldn't be shocked if towards the end of the season, we start hearing all these rumblings about, oh, Mike Trout is disgruntled. He's not too happy with the team. They have started to perform poorly. He's tired of not making the playoffs. This will be year 6 in a row that they don't make the playoffs. I mean, it's unacceptable, and I think it's a waste of his ability for this team. And I think that if this team, again, if they're going to just be not that great, but they're going to have this incredible player on their team, I think it's kind of cheating him out of being a winning player and somebody that has a lot of success in a team environment. And he could be used in a lot of other places for a lot of other teams, and that can do a lot of different things, right? I mean, a lot of different things. So ultimately, I do buy it. I do think that he will be out of LA, if not next season, then maybe after this offseason. In the next 2 years, yeah, absolutely. I could definitely, if they don't make the playoffs and if they finish under 500 in one of those seasons and they don't make the playoffs in either 2 seasons, he's gone. I think that he will fight his way out of there in whatever fashion he does it. I think that eventually he will be gone and he will want to be traded. I don't know if it will be granted. That's another conversation. But I think eventually he will be traded and he will be out of LA sooner than we think. But hopefully it doesn't get to that point. Hopefully they can start winning, and hopefully they can start building a winning team around him, which I think they've done this year. I really do. It's just, again, early on, might be too early to tell, and so we have some time to figure it out. But, folks, that's going to wrap it up for us here today. As always, thank you so much for listening to the GSMC Baseball Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I would like to ask that you please remember to subscribe to the show and write a nice review. That really helps us out. Also, if you can please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, we'd also really appreciate it. And until next time, everyone, thanks so much for joining in, and have a wonderful day.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Baseball Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. From movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.